welcome to our deep dive. We're focusing on beginner English, especially for Spanish speakers.
Yeah.
We've got some really interesting material to look at today.
Hola a todos. Yeah, we've got a fantastic lesson ready focusing on adverbs of frequency.
Adverbs of frequency, huh? I think those can be tricky for new learners.
Absolutely.
Because they change the meaning in kind of subtle ways.
Yes.
It's not just about what you do, but how often.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So think about like your daily routines. We might say, I always brush my teeth in the morning.
Right.
Or I sometimes go for a walk after dinner. So these words always, and sometimes they're telling us how often an action happens.
Oh, that's a great way to explain it.
Yeah.
So I never eat breakfast means I skip it every day.
Right.
But if I say I sometimes eat breakfast, it means there are days I do and days I don't.
Oh, yeah, you got it. And it's important to remember we can use these adverbs with different verbs.
Okay.
For example, we can use them with the verb to be.
Okay.
Like, I am always happy to see you.
Right. Or, she is sometimes late for work.
Oh, that's interesting. So the placement of the adverb changes.
Yes. Yeah.
Depending on the verb, right?
Right.
Okay. The source actually mentions some rules about this.
Yes, there are some key rules.
Okay.
The first one is when you use an adverb of frequency with the verb to be, the adverb goes after the verb.
Okay.
For instance, they are often late.
Right.
Becomes ellos a menudo llegan tarde in Spanish.
Ah, so the structure is similar in both languages.
Yes. Yes, it is.
That's helpful. What about sentences that don't use the verb to be?
Good question. For other verbs, the adverb usually goes before the main verb.
Okay.
Let's take the example. She sometimes eats breakfast early.
Okay.
In Spanish, we would say, ella a veces desayuna temprano.
Okay.
Notice how sometimes comes before the verb eats or desayuna.
Okay. So with to be, it goes after, but with other verbs, it goes before, usually.
Usually.
Yeah.
Got it. What are some other examples? I know the source mentions quite a few different adverbs of frequency.
Absolutely. We have always, usually, often, sometimes, rarely, seldom, hardly ever, and never.
Wow, that's a lot.
And of course, we have their equivalents in Spanish. Siempre, usualmente, a menudo, a veces, rara vez, casi nunca, and nunca.
Okay. That's a really helpful way to lay it all out. It's good to see the comparison. I noticed that some of those adverbs, though, are more negative.
Yes.
Like never or hardly ever. Does that change how we use them in a sentence at all?
Yes, you're right. That's a very important point. The source mentions that we can't use never or hardly ever in negative sentences.
And I couldn't say something like, I don't never eat pizza.
Exactly. That sounds strange,
Okay,
right?
done.
So, in English, we don't use double negatives. You would either say, I never eat pizza, or I don't eat pizza often, but not both.
Okay, got it. No double negatives. What about adverbs like usually and sometimes? I notice the source says those can go at the beginning or end of a sentence.
Yes, it is interesting, isn't it? And this is where the English language can be a bit flexible. You can say, usually I drink coffee in the morning, or I drink coffee in the morning, usually.
Okay.
And both sentences are grammatically correct and convey the same meaning.
So we have some options there. That's good to know. What stands out to you about these adverbs of frequency so far?
Well, what fascinates me is how adverbs of frequency can actually help us paint like a clearer picture
Oh, interesting.
of someone's habits or actions.
Okay.
They add that extra detail that can make communication more precise.
Right.
For example, if I say, she reads books, it's a very simple statement. But if I say, she often reads books, it tells you something about her personality
Oh, I see. Yeah.
and how she spends her time.
It adds a little something extra to the sentence.
Yes, it does.
And for someone learning English, being able to use those adverbs well can really help them express themselves more accurately.
Exactly. And it can also help them understand spoken English better.
Oh,
Because they'll be able to pick up on those nuances of meaning. So it's a win-win.
Totally agree. Now, beyond these like general adverbs of frequency, are there other ways to express how often something happens? The source mentions some more specific examples.
You're right. We can use phrases like every day, once a week, twice a month, and so on. These are a bit more specific, and they usually go at the end of the sentence.
Okay.
For example, I go to the gym 3 times a week. Or in Spanish, voy al gimnasio 3 veces a la semana.
Okay, so those are pretty straightforward, just adding a time frame to it. And I see the source also gives us the question we can use, to ask about frequency.
Yes.
How often, which is con qué frecuencia. in Spanish?
That's a great point. Learning how to ask questions is as important as learning how to answer them.
Right.
So let's practice. How often do you study English?
Good question. I try to practice every day, even if it's just for a few minutes. How about you?
Well, I'm always surrounded by English, but I still make an effort to read English books and watch English movies regularly.
Yeah.
It's important to keep learning and improving even when you're fluent.
Yeah, I love that. It's a good reminder. We've covered a lot of ground here with adverbs of frequency. It's amazing how much we can express with just a few simple words, really.
Absolutely. And remember, the key to mastering these adverbs is practice, practice, practice.
Right.
The more you use them, the more natural they will become.
Well said. And speaking of practice, our deep dive isn't over yet. The source also introduces another useful element of English grammar, the verb to last.
Ah, yes, to last. This verb, which means durar in Spanish, is all about expressing how long something takes or continues. A very practical verb to have in your English vocabulary.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Can you give us some examples of how we might use this verb in everyday conversation?
Of course. Imagine you're asking about the length of a movie. You could say, how long does this movie last? Or in Spanish, ¿cuánto dura esta película?
Okay, makes sense. And the answer might be, this movie lasts 2 hours. Or esta película dura 2 horas.
Exactly. And notice how we used that S at the end of last, because we're talking of the movie, which is singular. It's a small but important detail.
Oh, you're right. Those little grammar rules. I'm curious, are there any other ways we can use to last besides talking about the length of things?
Of course. We can use it to talk about how long an event or an activity continues. For example, the concert lasts 3 hours, or el concierto dura 3 horas.
Wait.
You can even use it to describe the duration of feelings or states of being.
Oh, okay.
Like, my happiness will last forever, or mi felicidad durará para siempre.
Wow, that's really versatile. I can see how to last is a really useful verb.
Yes, it is.
It can be used to express a lot of different things.
A lot of different things.
Okay, great.
And don't forget the question, how long does last, which is cuánto dura in Spanish.
Right.
Practice asking and answering this question with different objects and activities to really get the hang of using to last.
That's a great tip. I like how we're constantly connecting back to the Spanish, making it easier for our listeners to grasp the meanings and the structure. It's all about building those bridges.
I completely agree. The more connections we make, the more accessible and enjoyable the learning process becomes. And speaking of making things enjoyable, what are your thoughts on, using these new verbs and grammar rules in real life conversations?
I think the key is to not be afraid to experiment.
Yes.
And to make mistakes. The more you use the language, the more comfortable you'll become, even if you make a mistake. It's a learning opportunity.
I couldn't agree more. Mistakes are a natural part of the learning process, and they can actually help us improve faster. So embrace those mistakes and use them as stepping stones to fluency.
That's such a positive way to look at it. And I think it's especially important for beginner learners to hear that,
Yes.
Because it's easy to get discouraged when you're first starting out.
Yeah.
But everyone makes mistakes.
Absolutely. And the more you practice, the fewer mistakes you'll make. So keep practicing those adverbs of frequency and the verb to last, and I guarantee you'll see progress over time.
I love your confidence.
Yeah.
It's contagious. So we've covered a lot in this first part of our deep dive. Adverbs of frequency, the verb to last, and even the importance of practice in embracing those mistakes.
We have, and I think it's important to highlight that we've just scratched the surface here. There's so much more to explore.
I'm excited for the next part already. But before we move on, any final thoughts on what we've covered so far?
Well, I would just say this. Language learning is a journey.
Oh, I like that.
Not a destination. It's about discovering new ways to express yourself and to connect with the world around you.
Okay.
So enjoy the ride.
Beautifully said. I think that's a perfect note to end this part of our deep dive on. Stay tuned for the next part, where we'll dive into even more fascinating aspects of English grammar and vocabulary.
Hasta pronto. We'll be back with more tips and tricks to help you on your English learning adventure.
Can't wait. See you then.
Welcome back. It's been great exploring these, tricky adverbs of frequency and the versatile verb to last. Anything in particular resonate with you from what we talked about?
Definitely. Breaking down those adverb placement rules, especially comparing it to Spanish, I think that makes it really click.
Right.
Plus, who knew to last could be used in so many ways.
It's amazing how a simple word can be so powerful. And speaking of powerful tools, I think we should talk about the example phrases section from the source material.
Yes, this section's great.
Yes.
Packed with useful phrases for everyday situations, from greetings to asking for help. Almost like a cheat sheet,
It is. What I find fascinating is how these phrases incorporate the grammar that we've been discussing.
Oh, yeah, okay.
For example, it's good, but I don't like it, which translates to es bueno, pero no me gusta. So it uses a negative structure with the adverb don't to express a preference.
Oh, that's true. And it's not just about understanding the individual words, but how they fit together in a sentence.
Yes.
I don't usually talk to her becomes no suelo hablar con ella in Spanish.
Exactly.
Seeing those subtle differences in word order is key.
Absolutely. It's like learning the steps to a dance. You need to know the individual moves, but also the rhythm, the flow of the whole sequence. Now, this raises an important question for our listener. How can you use these example phrases to improve your speaking and comprehension?
That's a great question. I think one of the best ways is to practice saying them out loud, paying attention to the pronunciation and intonation, almost like rehearsing for a play.
Yes.
The more you practice, the more natural it will sound.
I love that analogy. And what's really helpful is that the source material provides the pronunciation for each phrase. So you can listen and repeat and, focus on getting those sounds just right.
Exactly. And beyond just saying the phrases, I think it's crucial to actually try using them in real conversations.
Yes.
Even if it's just with a language partner or a tutor, the act of putting them into practice helps solidify them in your memory.
I couldn't agree more. It's that jump from passive knowledge to active use that makes a difference.
Right.
It's like learning to ride a bike. You can read all about it, but you won't truly master it until you get on that bike and, start pedaling.
That's a perfect analogy. And speaking of pedaling forward, I notice the source material doesn't just provide those individual phrases, but it also gives examples of longer sentences.
You're right.
Which helps learners see how those phrases fit into a bigger context.
Exactly. Where does Miguel go every day?
Yeah.
Which becomes, ¿A dónde va Miguel todos los días?
Right.
It's building upon what we learn, showing how to, construct more complex questions.
Yeah. And I love how it incorporates, the vocabulary and the grammar we've been discussing. It's like all the pieces are starting to come together.
Exactly. It's like building a house, You start with the foundation, then the walls, and finally the roof. Each element is important and contributes to the overall structure.
I like that. So we've talked about practicing pronunciation, using phrases in conversations, and analyzing those longer sentences. What other advice would you give to, really maximize learning with this material?
Don't be afraid to, get creative.
Okay.
Take those example phrases as a starting point. And then personalize them. Change the names, the situations, make them relevant to your own life.
Yeah, I love that. It's like taking a recipe and then adding your own special twist to it. Makes it more fun and engaging.
Exactly. Learning a language should be a joyful experience, not a chore. And that brings me to another important point. Don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
It's part of the process.
Mistakes are actually valuable.
They are.
They're learning opportunities.
Absolutely. And the more you practice, the fewer mistakes you'll make. Remember, every expert was once a beginner.
I love that reminder. So encouraging. It's good to hear that everyone starts somewhere. Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to circle back to something we mentioned earlier. The importance of connecting English to Spanish.
Yes. It's so valuable, to find those parallels between the languages. It not only helps with understanding, but also makes learning less intimidating.
Right. It's like having a map.
Yes.
To guide you,
Exactly. So I would encourage our listener to pay attention to those connections. Look for patterns, compare the structures, and don't hesitate to ask questions.
Right.
The more you explore, the more confident you'll become.
That's great advice. It's all about being an active learner.
Yes.
And taking ownership.
Yeah.
I'm excited for the next part of our deep dive, where we'll explore even more advanced concepts.
Me too. We'll build upon what we've learned and give our listener even more tools to, take their English to the next level.
Welcome back to our deep dive. We've covered so much, adverbs of frequency, the verb to last, and even some of those tricky pronunciation things.
Yeah.
What from those parts really stuck with you?
You know, one thing that I find fascinating is how we can take all of these like individual pieces, of grammar and vocabulary and put them together and start to build like these more complex sentences. It's like those building blocks we talked about.
Right.
They're starting to like form a real structure now.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where I think this example phrases section in the source material really comes in handy.
It does.
Because it's got, all these longer sentences that showcase how, everything can be used in, real situations.
I'm looking at them now, and it's amazing how much variety there is. From, simple questions like, where's the bank? Which translates to, ¿Dónde está el banco? In Spanish, to more elaborate expressions like, I have to go to the doctor because I don't feel well.
Right.
Which becomes, tengo que ir al médico porque no me siento bien.
Yeah, I love how these examples like show the natural flow of an English conversation.
Absolutely.
It's not just, memorizing the words.
Yeah.
But understanding how it all connects.
Exactly. And that's where paying attention to those like subtle differences in word order between English and Spanish becomes so important.
Right.
For instance, I usually go to bed at 11.
Okay.
Translates to, normalmente me acuesto a las 1 in Spanish.
Right.
So notice how the adverb usually comes before the verb go in English, but the equivalent normalmente comes at the beginning of the sentence in Spanish.
Right. Yeah. It's those little variations that can, kind of trip you up when you're first starting. But I think seeing them, side by side makes it easier to kind of
recognize the pattern.
Yeah.
Adjust your thinking.
Exactly. What tips do you have for our listener, for how they can practice using these longer sentences?
Well, one technique I find really helpful is recording yourself.
Oh, okay.
Reading those sentences out loud.
Okay.
And then listening back. It allows you to catch any pronunciation errors and also work on your fluency.
That's a great idea. I like that a lot.
It's like having your own personal language coach.
Yeah. And beyond just reading them, I think, trying to actually use them in conversations is important.
Yes.
Even if you just adapt them slightly to fit the situation.
Absolutely.
Putting them into use will really help. And what if they use these example sentences as like a jumping off point?
Yes.
For creating their own phrases and sentences.
That's brilliant.
Yeah.
It's like taking the ingredients from a recipe and then creating your own culinary masterpiece.
Right, exactly.
It's a fantastic way to make the language your own, and truly internalize those concepts. And that brings us to, the heart of what we've been exploring in this deep dive. The joy of discovery.
Yeah, I love that. Learning a language is about so much more than just, memorizing rules and words, right?
It is.
It's about like opening yourself up to new ways of thinking and connecting with other cultures and like expanding your horizons.
Beautifully said. So as we wrap up our deep dive into beginner English for Spanish speakers, what is the one key message that you want our listeners to take away?
Oh, good question.
Embrace the journey.
Okay.
Learning a new language is an adventure. It's filled with like twists and turns and, exciting discoveries.
Yeah.
There will be moments of frustration, I guarantee you.
Sure.
But the rewards far outweigh the challenges. So be patient with yourself. Celebrate every milestone and never lose sight of, the joy of learning.
I love that. I think that really captures, what we try to do here on the deep dive, going beyond just skimming the surface and really like immersing ourselves in, the concepts, exploring them from all angles.
Yes.
I hope our listeners feel, empowered to continue exploring even after this episode ends.
Absolutely.
The world of English is vast. Lots to discover.
It is.
Keep practicing, keep exploring, and keep the joy of learning alive. Hasta pronto.
Adios. And may your English journey be filled with exciting new discoveries.
Thank you for joining us today on English Learning Podcast. I want to congratulate you for taking the time to improve your English. Every step counts, so keep moving forward and don't stop. If you enjoyed this content and want to learn more, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button so we can keep creating videos like this. Let us know in the comments what level of English you're at and what topics you'd like us to cover in the next episode. Also, check out the links in the description for additional resources to help you keep advancing. See you in the next video. And remember, English Learning Podcast is here to help you reach your English goals. Keep learning.